The three men who beat an 80-year-old woman and left her bleeding in the snow made one fatal mistake. They never checked what was on the shelf behind her. The old military radio's green light had been blinking for 48 hours, and the man receiving those signals doesn't negotiate, doesn't warn, and doesn't ever arrive late. Before we continue, quick question. If your mom sent a distress signal, how fast could you get to her? Drop your answer and what city you're watching from in the comments. And hey, if you think every parent deserves a kid who builds them a panic button, smash that subscribe button. We're racing to 1,000 subscribers, and honestly, Dorothy's doing more heavy lifting than half of you. Let's prove her right. Now, back to the night everything changed. The blizzard came down Route 47 like a living thing, erasing the mountain road one gust at a time. Dorothy Kelly's house sat at the end of that road, last driveway, last mailbox, last light before the wilderness swallowed everything. She'd learned to read storms the way other people read faces. This one wasn't passing through, it was settling in. Inside, the wood stove ticked as metal expanded with heat. Dorothy moved through the familiar darkness of her kitchen, every creak of the floorboards a word in a language she'd spoken for 40 years. Alone didn't mean helpless, it never had. The kettle was just beginning to whistle when the knock came. Not the tentative tap of a neighbor, not the courtesy double knock of the mail carrier. This was impatient, entitled. 3 shapes filled her porch, backlit by swirling white. Young men, maybe 30, with eyes that moved too quickly, scanning past her face, into her home, calculating what an old woman living alone might have worth taking. They saw the walker by the door, the pill bottles on the counter, the reading glasses hung on a chain. What they didn't see was the military radio on the bookshelf, its green light steady in the darkness. What they didn't know was that 48 hours earlier, during her weekly check-in, Dorothy had mentioned the storm to her son. Just casual conversation, the kind Elliot had been trained to read between the lines of, the kind a Navy SEAL commander never ignored. Dorothy's hand rested on the doorframe, not trembling, just still. She'd survived 8 decades by knowing exactly when to speak and when silence said more. These men thought the storm had given them cover. They had no idea it had already started a clock they couldn't see. The blizzard didn't announce itself. It just arrived, the way all inevitable things do. Quietly at first, then all at once. By the time Dorothy Kelly looked up from her book, Route 47 had disappeared beneath 2 feet of snow, and the wind was rewriting the landscape in white. She set the book down, moved to the window, watched the pines bend under the weight of ice until their branches touched the ground like arthritic fingers reaching for help that wouldn't come. The power had flickered twice already. She'd lit 3 candles and placed them in the bathroom, the hallway, and on the kitchen counter, not for light, but for landmarks. If the lights went out completely, she'd need to know where she was without thinking. At 80, thinking too hard in the dark could get you hurt. The wood stove radiated heat in waves that made the air shimmer. She'd learned 40 years ago how to bank a fire so it would burn all night without supervision. Wood stacked on the left side of the hearth, kindling on the right, ash bucket by the door. Everything had a place. Everything had a reason. Her hands moved through the familiar choreography of evening. Tea kettle filled, set on the stove. Medication sorted into the weekly pill organizer, Mondays through Sundays, morning and night. Reading glasses hung on the chain around her neck. Walker positioned between the living room and kitchen, exactly where she'd need it if her hip decided to remind her of that fall 2 winters back. The house settled around her with its usual groans and whispers. She knew every sound. The northeast corner always creaked when the temperature dropped below 20. The pipes hummed for exactly 4 seconds after the toilet flushed. The 3rd step from the bottom squeaked no matter how carefully you stepped. Tonight, those familiar sounds felt different, sharper, like the house itself was listening. The tea kettle was just beginning its low whistle when the knock came. Not the double tap of the mail carrier leaving a package, not the soft, apologetic knock of a neighbor needing to borrow something. This was the knock of someone who expected the door to open, who believed they had the right to demand it. Dorothy's hand stilled on the counter. She didn't move toward the door, didn't call out to ask who was there. She listened. 3 distinct shadows filled the frosted glass of her front door. Large, male, shifting their weight the way men do when they're cold but don't want to admit it. Her fingers found the chain of her reading glasses and gripped it, not out of fear, out of focus. The knock came again, harder, impatient. "Ma'am, we need help. Car stuck in the ditch down the road." The voice was young, practiced, the kind of politeness that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. Dorothy moved to the door, but not quickly. She let her walker scrape against the floor. Let them hear the shuffle of old feet taking their time. Let them build their assumptions. Through the peephole, she saw them clearly now. 3 men, maybe 30. Wet jackets, no gloves, breath coming in white clouds. Eyes that moved too fast, cataloging, calculating, already past her face and into the warmth of her home. She unlocked the deadbolt, left the chain on, opened the door 3 inches. "Storm's bad," she said. Her voice came out exactly as she intended. Elderly, thin, no threat at all. The nearest one smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, ma'am, real bad. We were wondering if we could use your phone. Ours aren't getting signals up here." Behind him, the other 2 had stopped pretending to be cold. They stood like men who were deciding something, like men who'd already decided. Dorothy's gaze moved past them to the rental car, idiot parked at an angle in her driveway. No snow on the hood yet. The engine is still ticking with heat. Not stuck in any ditch, not broken down. Just 3 men who'd seen a lone house at the end of a dead-end road and thought the storm had given them permission. "Phone's in the kitchen," she said, and stepped back. The doors swung open wider. Cold air rushed in, bringing the smell of cheap cologne and something else. Sweat, despite the freeze. Adrenaline sweat. The kind that comes before violence, not after. They filled her small entryway, suddenly massive in the contained space. Snow melted off her boots onto her floor. The nearest one's eyes went immediately to the pill bottles on the counter, to the walker, to the way her hand trembled slightly on the doorframe, a tremor she'd learned to summon on command decades ago, back when being underestimated had kept her safe in rooms full of men who thought they knew better. "You live here alone, ma'am?" The question was casual. The eyes weren't. "I do," Dorothy said. She didn't elaborate, didn't mention her son, didn't explain that the military radio on the bookshelf, its green light steady and patient in the corner, had already told Elliot everything he needed to know about tonight 48 hours ago, before the storm even had a name. The door clicked shut behind them. The wind stopped howling. And in the sudden silence, Dorothy Kelly realized these men had no idea they'd just locked themselves in with the wrong kind of waiting. The pretense lasted exactly as long as it took for the door to close. The one who'd done the talking, the leader, though Dorothy doubted he'd earned that position through anything resembling competence, dropped his apologetic smile like a coat he no longer needed. His hand came up, not to his phone, but to the deadbolt. He turned it with a deliberate click that echoed through the small house. "Here's how this works," he said, voice stripped of its earlier courtesy. "You sit down, you stay quiet. We take what we need, and nobody gets hurt." Dorothy's fingers tightened on her walker, not from fear, from calculation. 3 men, 1 exit they were blocking. Hip that couldn't support a run even if her pride could. The mathematics of the situation were simple and brutal. "My purse is on the table," she said. Her voice stayed level, cooperative. There's maybe $40. Credit cards are, we're not here for $40. The second one, shorter, meaner, with a scar that cut through his left eyebrow, moved toward her living room. His boots left wet prints on the hardwood she'd refinished herself 3 years ago, back when her hands were steadier. Nice place, isolated. Bet you got all kinds of things tucked away up here. The third man said nothing, just watched. That was somehow worse. They spread through her home like a stain, opening drawers, dumping contents, hands violating the careful order she'd spent decades building. Her mother's jewelry box hit the floor. Costume pieces, worthless except for memory, scattered across the carpet. Please, Dorothy said, not begging, testing, seeing how far courtesy would carry before it snapped. The leader turned back to her. Please what? Please stop? He laughed, short and cold. You're 80 years old, alone on a mountain in a blizzard. Who's going to make us? That's when his hand caught her shoulder. Not a grab, a shove. Casual violence, the kind that came from a lifetime of knowing no one would stop him. Dorothy's hips screamed as she stumbled. Her walker clattered aside. She went down hard, knees hitting the floor with a crack that sent white fire up her spine. The cold from the open door mixed with the heat from the wood stove, creating a nauseating swirl that made her stomach lurch. The taste of blood filled her mouth. She'd bitten her tongue. Stay down, the leader said. He was already turning away, bored with her. The floor was hardwood, unforgiving. Dorothy's cheek pressed against it, close enough to see dust motes caught in the baseboards, close enough to smell the lemon polish she used every Sunday. Her reading glasses had fallen off, the chain tangled around her neck. Pain radiated from her hip, her knees, her shoulder where his hand had connected. But underneath the pain, underneath the humiliation of being sprawled on her own floor while strangers ransacked her life, something else stirred. Count their voices, memorize their faces, note which one leads. The training was Elliot's years ago, explained over kitchen table coffee during one of his rare visits home. If something ever happens, Mom, don't fight if you can't win, but don't stop gathering intelligence either. There's always time to act. You just have to choose when. Dorothy's hand moved, slowly, trembling in a way that looked like shock but wasn't. Her fingers found the edge of the side table, the one with the phone she told them about, but not the landline sitting in plain view. The cell phone, the one tucked in the drawer underneath, fully charged, its emergency SOS function activated 2 days ago when Elliot's weekly check-in had gone longer than usual, and she'd mentioned, so casually, that a storm was coming and the road would be impassable. Her thumb found the volume button, pressed it 3 times in quick succession. The phone didn't ring, didn't light up, but somewhere in a system she didn't fully understand but had learned to trust, a silent alarm was screaming into the void. Location transmitted, duration of distress noted, patterns analyzed by algorithms designed for soldiers in hostile territory, not elderly mothers in mountain homes, but effective all the same. Did you find anything? The leader's voice came from her bedroom, the sound of her closet being torn apart, her winter coats hitting the floor. Nothing yet. The old lady probably keeps some money in a mattress or some shit. Dorothy's breath came in shallow gasps, real pain, real fear, but underneath a core of ice-cold patience that came from raising a boy who'd learned early that protection wasn't about being present, it was about being prepared. The quiet one finally spoke. We should go. The storm's getting worse. 5 more minutes. Check the basement. Boots on stairs, drawers slamming. Her father's war medals, worthless to anyone but her, scattered like trash. Dorothy stayed on the floor. Let them see what they expected, a broken old woman, helpless and defeated. Let them believe the trembling in her hands was terror and nothing else. She didn't see the green light on the radio blink twice, then steady. Didn't see the frequency shift as encrypted data packets bounced through military channels designed for precisely this kind of silence. But she knew. The same way she'd known when Elliot was 7 and had fallen from the oak tree before she heard him cry.
the same way she'd known when he'd shipped out for his first deployment before the official notice arrived. Some connections don't need sound to transmit. The men were arguing now about whether to check the attic. The leader wanted to, the quiet one wanted to leave. Dorothy closed her eyes and counted seconds, each one a small victory, each one a message being received hundreds of miles away by a man who spent his entire adult life learning how to turn information to action. They'd made one crucial mistake tonight, just one. They assumed that being alone meant being unprotected. Okay, pause. Show of hands. Who else just got chills when she pressed that button 3 times? If you're the type who believes in backup plans for your backup plans, do me a favor. Hit like so YouTube knows you're not just scrolling past badassery. Also, comment on your country or city. I'm genuinely curious if Navy SEAL kids are a universal flex or just an American thing. We're 437 subscribers away from 1K, and at this rate, Dorothy's gonna hit it before we do. Don't let an 80-year-old outwork you. Now, let's talk about what happened when that signal reached the other side. The taillights disappeared into the whiteout 20 minutes after they'd shoved through her door. Dorothy watched from the floor until the red glow became nothing, swallowed by snow that fell so thick it seemed solid. Then she moved. Not quickly. Her body had its own timeline now, one measured in sharp breaths and careful weight shifts. Her hips sang with pain as she leveraged herself up using the overturned walker. The metallic taste in her mouth had spread, coating her teeth, reminding her that she'd bitten through her tongue when she fell. The house looked like a crime scene, because it was. Drawers gaped open. Her mother's jewelry, worthless rhinestones and tarnished silver, glittered among the chaos like broken teeth. They'd taken the $40 from her purse, left the credit cards, smart enough to know those could be traced, taken her father's bronze star, too stupid to know it was only worth something to her. Dorothy's hands shook as she righted a kitchen chair. Real shock now, adrenaline bleeding out of her system and leaving her hollowed. She sat down hard, bones protesting. The candles still burned. The wood stove still radiated heat. The storm still howled against windows that had survived worse winters than this. And the radio's green light still pulsed, steady as a heartbeat. She stared at it for a long moment. The old Motorola military-grade transceiver Elliot had installed 4 years ago, back when he'd stopped pretending his visits were just social calls and started calling them security assessments. It sat on the 3rd shelf of the bookshelf, partially hidden behind a framed photo of him at 22, fresh out of Bud's training, eyes already carrying weight she couldn't name. "It's just in case, Mom," he said, connecting wires she didn't understand to a system that monitored things she didn't need to know about. "You probably won't ever use it, but if you do, just press this sequence. That's all. Just press it and I'll know." She nodded, made coffee, changed the subject to something easier, like whether he was eating enough or sleeping at all, questions he'd deflect with that half-smile that meant, "I can't tell you, and you wouldn't want to know." The emergency function on her cell phone was his idea too. Triple press the volume button, location transmitted instantly to a network that didn't rely on civilian towers or normal emergency services. A network designed for soldiers behind enemy lines who couldn't afford to wait for help that might never come. Dorothy stood, slower this time, testing her weight on the hip that would ache for weeks. She crossed to the bookshelf, each step deliberate. Her fingers found the radio's face, tracing the frequency dial she'd been taught never to touch. The green light blinked once, acknowledging her presence the way it always did when she came near. Elliot had programmed it to recognize her movement patterns, her proximity, had explained it once using words like biometric sensors and thermal signature that has slid past her like water. What she'd understood was simpler. This will keep you connected, even when I can't be here. She thought about that now, about all the years she raised a boy who was quieter than other children, more watchful, who noticed things other kids missed and asked questions that made teachers uncomfortable, who'd announced at 17 that he was joining the Navy, and she knew with a certainty that only mothers possess, that he wasn't joining for college money or adventure, but because something in him needed to be useful in a way civilian life couldn't satisfy. The first deployment nearly broke her, not knowing where he was.
Not knowing if the doorbell would ring with men in dress uniforms carrying folded flags and practice condolences, she'd learned to live with silence, with gaps in communication that could last months, with birthday calls that came 3 weeks late from satellite phones on ships she couldn't name and waters he couldn't mention. But she'd also learned that silence didn't mean absence. The second candle guttered out. Dorothy lit another, her hand steadier now. The ritual of it, match against striker, sulfur smell, flame catching, grounded her in the present. Her tongue had stopped bleeding. The swelling in her hip would peak tomorrow. The bruises would bloom purple and yellow, a timeline of violence written on skin that had already survived 8 decades of smaller cruelties. She looked at the destruction around her, at her life scattered across floors she'd walked for 40 years, at the violation of space she'd carefully curated to be exactly enough for one person living alone. The rage she expected didn't come. Or maybe it had, and she'd already burned through it during those minutes on the floor, counting seconds, pressing buttons, gathering intelligence while they'd assumed she was gathering nothing but fear. What came instead was something colder, more patient. Dorothy moved through the house, not cleaning, not yet, but cataloging. She found where they'd pried open her bedroom window, thinking about escape routes even as they'd entered through the front door. Found muddy boot prints on her white bathroom rug, the pattern distinct enough to identify brand and size. Found the spot where one of them had stopped to drink directly from her kitchen faucet, DNA left behind on the tap like a signature. Evidence, Elliot would call it. Intelligence. She took photos with her cell phone, methodical, thorough, each angle documented, each detail preserved. Not for the police. They wouldn't make it up the mountain until the storm broke, and by then, evidence would matter less than it did right now at this moment while everything was still fresh. The radio's light shifted from green to amber. Dorothy went still. She'd seen it change colors before, during tests Elliot ran on his rare visits home. Green meant standby, amber meant receiving, red meant transmitting. It had never changed on its own. She watched as the amber light pulsed 3 times, then returned to green. A message received, acknowledged, filed into whatever vast network connected her son's world to hers. Somewhere, she didn't know where, couldn't know where, someone was looking at data she'd sent without fully understanding what she was sending. Someone was seeing her location, her distress markers, the duration and intensity of the emergency signal that had screamed silently into military channels while 3 men ransacked her home and believed themselves untraceable. Dorothy touched the photo of young Elliot, his face serious beneath his white navy cap. "I'm okay," she whispered to the empty room, to the storm, to the son who might be on a ship in the Pacific, or in a desert on the other side of the world, or in places that didn't appear on maps at all. But they're not going to be. The wind shifted. The house settled. The storm continued its work of erasing roads and creating isolation. But isolation, Dorothy had learned, was never quite as complete as it seemed. And silence had never been the same thing as helplessness.
The storm that had isolated Dorothy's mountain was the same storm that grounded civilian flights in 3 states, closed highways from Denver to Salt Lake, and sent ordinary people scrambling for shelter. It didn't ground the CH-47 Chinook that lifted off from Fort Carson at 03:47 hours. Military helicopters don't ask permission from the weather. They fly missions regardless of what civilian radar suggests is advisable. And when Commander Elliot Kelly's emergency network pinged with his mother's distress signal, duration, location, biometric stress markers all confirming active threat, the storm became irrelevant. Dorothy didn't know this, couldn't know this, but she felt it anyway. It started as a shift in air pressure, or maybe that was just her hip talking, the way joints predict weather better than any forecast. She stood at her kitchen window, watching dawn try to break through clouds that refused to yield, and felt something change. The storm was still violent, still relentless, but it felt different now, less like a cage and more like a cover. She'd slept in her recliner, unable to face the bedroom they'd violated, the mattress they'd torn apart looking for money that didn't exist. 3 hours of fractured rest interrupted by pain and the wind's constant assault on windows that rattled but held. Her phone rang at 6:47. Not the cell with its encrypted connections, the landline, the old rotary that still worked when everything else failed, the one she'd kept connected out of habit and stubbornness. Dorothy moved slowly to answer it. Her hip had stiffened overnight, turning each step into negotiation. "Mom?" One word. Elliot's voice, satellite delayed by a fraction of a second, that strange echo that meant he was far away, but close enough to reach her anyway. "I'm all right," she said, before he could ask, before he could carry the weight of not being there. "I know what happened." Not a question, a statement of fact delivered in the tone he used when emotion would only slow things down. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing that won't heal." Silence on the line, not empty, full of everything he wasn't saying. Then, "Stay inside today. Don't open the door for anyone you don't know. Understand?" "Elliot, do you understand, Mom?" The edge in his voice wasn't anger. It was something more controlled, more dangerous. "Yes," she said. "Good. I'll call you tonight." The line went dead before she could respond. Dorothy stood, holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone, understanding what hadn't been spoken. Elliot was 800 miles away, doing work she couldn't ask about in placements he couldn't name. But distance had never meant helplessness. Not for him. Not from men trained to reach targets that believed themselves unreachable. Somewhere, wheels were already turning. The 3 men who'd torn through Dorothy's home were making breakfast at a Motel 6 30 miles down the mountain. The storm had forced them off the road at midnight, and they'd holed up in a room that smelled like cigarettes and industrial cleaner, counting their take. $40, one bronze star that might pawn for 20 if they found the right buyer, and a jade pendant that looked real enough to risk.
"Waste of time," the scarred one said, throwing the pendant on the bed. "Should have hit the house 2 miles back. That one had a truck in the driveway. Probably tools, electronics." "That one had lights on," the leader said. "People home. This worked because the old lady was alone." The quiet one said nothing, just watched snow fall past their window, accumulation already past 2 feet. None of them noticed the white Ford Explorer that had been parked in the lot since 0530, 3 spaces down, engine off, 2 men inside who hadn't moved in over an hour. The Explorer's occupants wore civilian clothes, jeans, winter jackets, nothing remarkable. But their posture was wrong for civilians. Too straight, too still. And the equipment on the passenger seat, laptop connected to antenna arrays civilians didn't have access to, glowed with data streams tracking cell signals, license plates, and facial recognition software pulling images from gas station cameras along Route 47. Military intelligence didn't advertise, didn't announce, didn't operate domestically except when matters of national security intersected with personal threats against protected individuals. Dorothy Kelly qualified. Had qualified since Elliot made 04 and started running missions that couldn't be compromised by leverage against family members. The system was automatic. Threat detected, resources deployed, protection activated. Not because she'd asked, because Elliot had built her into his operational security years ago, when protection was something he could delegate to networks more reliable than his own presence. One of the men in the Explorer lifted a camera, telephoto lens, clicked 3 shots of the motel room window where shadows moved against drawn curtains. Confirmed targets, location locked, local authorities already notified through channels that didn't require explanation or warrants, just information shared between agencies that knew better than to ask questions when JSOC made requests. Dorothy made tea she didn't drink, straightened furniture she didn't have strength to fully right. Her body was shutting down systems, redirecting everything to healing.
leaving her light-headed and slow. But her mind stayed sharp. She kept returning to the window, watching the road she couldn't see through the storm, waiting for something she couldn't name. The radio's light had stayed green since dawn. No amber pulses, no communication she could detect. But that didn't mean nothing was happening. It meant whatever was happening had moved beyond her participation. Dorothy understood this, had lived 30 years knowing Elliot's work continued in silence, in spaces she wasn't clear to know about, solving problems she'd never hear the full truth about. Mothers of operators learned a specific kind of faith, not religious, tactical. Trust built on pattern recognition, on watching boys become men who treated promises like sacred contracts and followed through with precision that bordered on obsessiveness. If Elliot said he'd call tonight, he'd call tonight. If he'd said stay inside, there was a reason.
At 10:15 a.m., Dorothy saw movement at the end of her road. Not the rental car returning, not neighbors checking on her. The storm had made that impossible, and her nearest neighbor was half a mile away regardless. This was different. A dark SUV moving carefully through snow that should have been impassable. Not struggling, equipped. Purpose-built for exactly this terrain, this weather, this mission. It stopped at the base of her driveway, didn't approach the house, just stopped. Sat there, engine running, windows tinted dark enough that she couldn't see who was inside. Dorothy's hand found the counter edge, steadied herself. The SUV sat for 3 minutes, 5, not moving, not leaving. Then her landline rang again. She picked up on the second ring. "There's a vehicle at the end of your driveway," Elliot said. "Friend of mine. He's going to make sure you're safe until I can get there myself. You don't need to let him in. He'll stay on side. Just wanted you to know he's there." Dorothy's throat tightened. "When will you?" 48 hours, maybe less. "Mom." His voice softened just slightly, the edge dulling into something that sounded almost like the boy who'd scraped his knee falling off his bike and refused to cry about it. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. You're here now." And she meant it. Because the SUV at the end of her driveway, and the men in the Explorer 30 miles away, and the networks tracking 3 criminals who thought they had gotten away with something, all of it was Elliot. All of it was protection that didn't require his physical presence to be real. The line went quiet but didn't disconnect. She could hear him breathing, satellite delay making it feel like he was underwater, drowning in distance. "They're going to wish," Elliot said slowly, each word deliberate, "that they'd chosen a different house." Then he was gone. Dorothy set the phone down, looked out at the SUV still sitting sentinel in the storm. She looked at the radio's steady green light. She looked at the photo of her son in his white dress, young and serious and already carrying the weight of what he would become. The storm howled. The house settled. And somewhere out there, justice was moving with the kind of patience that only comes from absolute certainty of outcome. The arrests happened at 11:47 a.m. in the Motel 6 parking lot, and Dorothy didn't see them. She only learned about it 3 days later when a sheriff's deputy knocked on her door, properly this time, badge visible, apologetic about the intrusion. He'd come to take her statement, he said. 3 men had been charged with burglary, assault, and a list of other crimes that stretched back 2 states. They'd waived their right to trial, pled guilty to everything. "Usually it takes months to get to this point," the deputy said, reviewing his notes. "But these guys, they couldn't cooperate fast enough, like they were afraid of something worse than prison." Dorothy nodded, said nothing. The deputy didn't ask about the federal agents who'd been first on scene, didn't mention the unusual jurisdictional cooperation that had flagged the suspect's vehicle before local police even knew to look. Some questions, his silence suggested, weren't meant to be answered. What Dorothy did see was this. The SUV stayed at the end of her driveway for 16 hours, changed shifts once. She watched through the window as two different men climbed out at midnight, moving with the same controlled precision, exchanging words she couldn't hear before the first pair drove away in the second vehicle she hadn't noticed arrived. They never approached the house, never asked for anything, just maintained their post through the worst of the storm, a presence that should have felt threatening, but instead felt like the opposite of loneliness. Elliot came home on the third day, not in uniform, never in uniform when he visited, just jeans and a jacket that looked civilian but fit in a way that suggested body armor underneath. He'd driven through the night, he said, took leave he'd been saving, wanted to check on her himself. Dorothy was in the kitchen when she heard his truck, not the rental car sound of strangers with bad intentions, her son's diesel engine, unmistakable after 30 years, the one constant in a life defined by his absences. She moved to the door, slower than she would have a week ago. Her hips still complained, bruises still bloomed purple across her ribs, but she was healing. Bodies were good at that, given time. Elliot was out of the truck before she could navigate the porch steps, met her halfway, hands gentle on her shoulders, eyes scanning her face with an assessment that was both medical and tactical. "I'm okay," she said again, the same words she'd given him on the phone, meaning them more now. He pulled her into a hug that was careful of her injuries, but solid enough to mean something. Dorothy closed her eyes, let herself be held, let herself be for just this moment, not the strong one, not the survivor, just a mother whose son had come home. "I should have been here," he said into her hair. "You were." She pulled back enough to see his face. "You've always been here, Elliot, just not the way you think you need to be." They went inside. He surveyed the house with the same scanning look he'd given her, cataloging damage, assessing what needed fixing, already making plans. The deputy had returned her father's Bronze Star. The thieves had dropped it when the police closed in. Elliot picked it up now from where she'd placed it back on the mantel, turned it over in his hands.
"Grandpa would have handled this differently," he said. "Grandpa would have shot them." Dorothy lowered herself into her recliner, the one that had become her refuge during the aftermath. "You did better. I wasn't here to do anything. You built a system that didn't need you here." She watched him process that, watching the tension in his shoulders ease just slightly. "That's not a weakness, Elliot. That's wisdom." He sat down on the couch across from her, rubbed his face with both hands, the gesture revealing exhaustion he was too disciplined to show otherwise. "When the alert came through, He stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I couldn't leave immediately. I had to wait for transport. Every minute felt like, I know, and she did. Because she'd lived that same helplessness every time he deployed, every time months passed without contact, every time the news reported casualties in regions he might or might not be operating in." The wood stove ticked. The house settled. Outside, the storm had finally broken, leaving the mountain buried in silence that felt clean instead of oppressive. "They'll serve 5 to 10, Elliot said. "Federal charges added time. They won't bother you again." Dorothy nodded. She'd expected as much. Men who attacked an 80-year-old woman for $40 weren't the kind who learned lessons easily. But men who discovered that an 80-year-old woman was connected to networks that could find them anywhere, track them through systems they didn't know existed, and deliver consequences without mercy or delay, those men learned very quickly. "The radio," she said. "You can explain it to me now. How it works." Elliot smiled, small but real. "You don't want to know. Trust me. Try me." So he did. Spent an hour explaining signal encryption and biometric sensors and how the emergency system had triangulated her location and stress markers and sent alerts to 3 different networks simultaneously, each one triggering its own response protocol. Dorothy understood maybe 30% of it, but she understood the core truth underneath all the technical language. Her son had spent years building a safety net so sophisticated she'd never see all its threads, had woven protection into infrastructure she didn't even know she was touching, had made sure that being alone never actually meant being unguarded. "That's a lot of effort," she said when he finished.
for one old woman on a mountain. Elliot's expression shifted, something raw breaking through the tactical mask he wore like skin. You're not just one old woman. You're the only thing in this world I can't afford to lose. They spent the rest of that day putting the house back together. Elliot fixing things she couldn't reach, reorganizing furniture too heavy for her to move, installing new locks he'd brought with him, deadbolts that could withstand battering rams, contacts on windows that would alert the system if they opened unexpectedly. Bit much for a mountain house, Dorothy observed. Humor me. She did. That night, they ate dinner at her small kitchen table. Elliot had cooked. Nothing fancy, just pasta and store-bought sauce, but made with the same precision he brought to everything. They talked about small things, the weather, her garden plans for spring, his carefully edited version of where he'd been recently, stories scrubbed clean of anything classified.
Before he left the next morning, back to base, back to work he couldn't discuss, Elliot stood at the door and pulled something from his pocket. A small device, looked like a key fob. "New panic button," he said. "Just press it once, that's all. Single press and everything activates." Dorothy took it, lighter than she expected. The old system worked fine. "This one's better." He kissed her forehead. "I'll call you next week. Be safe. Always." A lie they both pretended to believe. Dorothy watched his truck disappear down the mountain road, tail lights becoming memories. Then she turned back to her house, her fortress, her sanctuary, her carefully constructed life that had been violated and defended and restored. The military radio's green light pulsed once, steady and patient. She thought about the three men who'd seen her age and her isolation and mistaken both for vulnerability. She thought about how many others in the world made the same mistake every day, assuming that silence meant consent, that gentleness meant weakness, that being alone was the same as being powerless. Dorothy Kelly had survived 80 decades by knowing when to speak and when to wait, when to show strength and when to let others underestimate what they were facing. The storm had passed. The mountain road would be cleared by tomorrow. Life would return to its quiet rhythms of solitude and small routines. But something had shifted. Some understanding had settled into place. She'd never been as alone as she looked, and the men who'd learned that lesson the hard way had paid for their education with years they'd never get back. Justice, she thought, didn't always arrive with sirens and spectacle. Sometimes it came quietly, precisely, delivered by systems so sophisticated they were invisible until they needed to be seen. And sometimes the strongest protection came from connections that didn't require presence, just the unwavering certainty that someone, somewhere, was always watching, always waiting, always ready. Dorothy poured herself tea, sat in her recliner, opened her book to the page she'd marked a lifetime ago, before three strangers had mistaken her silence for an invitation. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle this time, forgiving, covering everything in white that looked like peace but felt like promise. So here's the thing. 1,000 people need to subscribe to this channel so I can keep telling stories about folks like Dorothy who refuse to stay victims. Right now, we're at 150, which means we need 850 of you to stop lurking and actually click the button. Comment below. What's the most underestimated person you know? What city are you repping? And if this story made you feel literally anything, share it, because honestly, the world needs more reminders that silence isn't weakness, it's just a strategy. See you in the next one, where we'll find out what happens when people mistake kindness for permission.